Some names and details in this story have been changed for anonymity and confidentiality. Not all photographs are from the actual scene.
On September 23, 2023, deep in the forests of Olympic National Park, Washington, two poachers searching for rare moss came across something that shouldn't have been there. 15 feet up, wedged in the fork of an old, lichen-covered maple tree, was a dirty yellow plastic case. It was hermetically sealed and chained to the branch with a rusty bicycle lock. When the Rangers, called to the scene by an anonymous caller, cut the case open and opened it, there was no money or drugs inside. There was only a single Sony camcorder, manufactured a decade ago, and a notebook whose pages were scribbled in small, shaky handwriting. The last entry was dated November 17, 2018, exactly 40 days after the camera's owner had officially gone missing 20 miles away. On August 14, 2010, the heat in Grand Canyon National Park reached 105 degrees Fahrenheit in the shade. It was the kind of dry, relentless heat that evaporates sweat before it even touches your clothes. Around 9 o'clock in the morning, a gray sedan pulled into the crowded parking lot of the historic Bright Angel Lodge. Behind the wheel was Karen Brown, a 30-year-old pharmacist from Phoenix. CCTV cameras at the entrance captured her calmly parking the car, checking the contents of her backpack, and locking the door. That was the last time her car was caught on camera. Karen looked like a person who had prepared well for the canyon challenge. She was wearing light gray professional trekking pants that could protect her from thorny bushes, a bright blue t-shirt that was clearly visible against the red rocks, and expensive hiking boots. She planned to hike the Bright Angel Trail to the Plateau Point Lookout and return the same day. It was an ambitious plan for a solo hiker in this weather. 12 miles of trail with elevation changes that required a lot of endurance. According to other hikers who were later interviewed by the Rangers, Karen was moving confidently and kept a good pace. At 11 o'clock in the morning, she was seen in the Indian Garden area, an oasis of greenery in the middle of a rocky desert, where hikers usually stop to rest before the final push to the plateau. A group of students from California remembered a woman in a blue t-shirt near a water source. One of them later told investigators that she was filling a large plastic canteen and looked perfectly healthy, with no signs of heat stroke or dehydration. She briefly greeted them, smiled, and continued on her way toward the Colorado River. After that meeting, Karen Brown's trail disappeared into the hot Arizona air. At the hotel where Karen had booked a room for one night, her absence on the evening of August 14th did not raise any suspicion. The front desk staff, accustomed to the chaotic schedules of tourists, simply canceled the reservation the next morning, attributing it to a change in the client's plans. No one checked to see if her car had returned to the parking lot. No one informed the park security service about the guest who did not show up for the night. This indifference cost the investigation 3 precious days. The alarm didn't start until August 17th. Karen's parents, who lived in Scottsdale, had been waiting for a call from their daughter on the 15th, as they had agreed before she left. At first, they thought that communication problems in the mountains were commonplace, but when the silence dragged on for 48 hours, panic began to build. Karen's father made more than 50 calls to her cell phone, but each time, he heard only the cold voice of the answering machine. After a call to work, where colleagues reported that Karen had not come to work and had not called in sick, it became clear that something bad had happened. At 10 o'clock and 30 minutes in the morning, on August 17th, Karen's father contacted the National Park Police. The search operation began 72 hours late. For Grand Canyon conditions, where daytime temperatures kill in a matter of hours, this was a death sentence. The trail that the dogs could have taken had long since frozen over and had been trampled by hundreds of other hikers who had passed through the trail over the 3 days. The Rangers mobilized all available resources. A helicopter equipped with a thermal imager was taken into the air, although the chances of finding a heat trail after all this time were slim. 3 groups of volunteers and dog handlers worked on the ground. They combed every ravine and gorge along the Bright Angel route. The accident theory was the main one. Karen could have slipped, fainted from the heat, or strayed off the trail for a spectacular photo. But the canyon was silent. No bodies, no signs of a struggle or fall at the popular viewpoints. The helicopter circled over Plateau Point for hours, cutting through the air with its blades, but the pilot saw only endless layers of red sandstone and sparse bushes. The only breakthrough in the search occurred on August 19th, the 5th day after the disappearance. A volunteer group working in a sector 300 yards away from the main hiking trail noticed an unnatural sheen in the juniper bushes. Wading through the thorny branches, one of the searchers found an expensive trekking pole. It was lying there as if it had been dropped or thrown. On the handle, worn from use, were clearly engraved the initials KB. This discovery raised more questions than it answered. The location of the stick was in an area where an ordinary tourist would not go without a good reason. There were no viewpoints, no shade, no water sources. It was a dead end leading to steep cliffs. Why did the experienced hiker, who, according to witnesses, felt fine, leave the safe path and head into the thicket of thorny bushes? And why did she leave some of her equipment there? The search within a 1-mile radius of the found stick lasted another 10 days. The rescuers roped themselves down into dangerous crevices, checked every cave accessible from the surface, and sifted through the sand for other items. But there was nothing else. No second stick, no backpack, no trace of blood. Karen Brown seemed to have vanished into thin air at the exact point where she dropped the stick. On August 30th, 2010, after 2 weeks of grueling and fruitless work, the park management made a difficult decision. The active phase of the search was terminated. The case was officially reclassified as a missing person. Karen's parents were informed that the chances of finding their daughter alive were 0. The case file was archived, becoming another unsolved mystery among thousands of others. But one of the young rangers who found the stick noted a detail in his report that no one had noticed at the time. The ground around the juniper bush where the find was lying was strangely loosened, as if someone had tried to cover their tracks, not by wind or a branch, but by something heavy and wide, dragged along the ground in the direction of old mines that were closed to the public. On December 5th, 2012, the Grand Canyon looked like a frozen sea of red stone covered in frost. 844 days had passed since Karen Brown's disappearance. The case had long since become a cold case, and her name was mentioned only in the context of sad accident statistics. But the canyon, which had remained silent for so long, was preparing to reveal one of its darkest secrets that day. The events were unfolding in one of the most isolated and inaccessible sectors of the park, northwest of a geological formation known as Horseshoe Mesa. This area is not marked on tourist maps as a recommended route. There are no equipped trails, water sources, or mobile communications. That's why this place attracted a group of 4 experienced extreme hikers who called themselves shadow seekers. They deliberately ignored the official warnings of the rangers, searching for unmarked slopes and wild caves where no ordinary person had ever set foot. At about 14 o'clock, the group began descending the scree to a narrow gorge hidden behind a pile of boulders. The leader of the group, a 30-year-old climber named Derek, later told investigators that a strange opening in the rock that resembled the entrance to a karst cave caught their attention. The wind coming out of it had a specific smell, a mixture of dampness and something musty that didn't resemble the usual smell of minerals. The descent was difficult. Stones were falling from under their feet, and every step required maximum concentration. When they reached the entrance, the sun was already sinking, and deep shadows lay in the gorge. The tourists turned on powerful headlamps, whose rays cut through the darkness of the grotto. The cave was deeper than it seemed from the outside. The floor was covered with a thick layer of dust and small gravel. After walking about 50 feet deep, Derek suddenly stopped. He noticed footprints on the dusty stone. They were not boot prints or animal paws. They were strange, smeared furrows, as if someone had crawled or dragged something heavy. The tracks led into the darkness, around a bend in a stone corridor. The group moved on, keeping their guard up. Around the bend, the cave widened, forming a small hall with a low ceiling. The flashlight beam caught a pile of rags in the far corner. It looked like old trash left by someone years ago, but when the light focused, the tourists froze. Among the dirty, moldy blankets was something that at first glance resembled an abandoned plastic mannequin. The object was unnaturally white and completely motionless, but when one of the tourists took a step forward, the mannequin moved slightly. It was a human being. A woman was lying on a pile of old clothes. Her state of exhaustion was critical. Her skin was so tight around her bones that it seemed translucent, and every vein was visible. But that was not the worst thing. The woman was completely bald. There was not a single hair on her head. There were no eyebrows, no eyelashes, not even the slightest fuzz on her arms. Her skin was unnaturally smooth, as if polished, and had the deadly pale hue characteristic of creatures that had not seen sunlight for years. Shock gave way to an attempt to help. "We are here to help you. Can you hear us?" asked one of the group, slowly approaching. The woman's reaction was immediate and terrifying. When she saw the men, she did not reach out and cry out in relief. She pressed her back into the stone wall, trying to merge with the cold rock. Her eyes, huge on her emaciated face, were full of animal horror. She opened her mouth in an attempt to scream, but no sound escaped her throat. Only a hoarse, dry hiss. There was no voice. She gasped silently for air, trembling all over. Realizing that the situation was critical and it was impossible to transport her on their own, the group activated the satellite phone. The call came to the park's dispatch center at 14 hours, 45 minutes. The coordinates pointed to a point where it was extremely difficult for the helicopter to reach due to the terrain. The rescue operation lasted more than 4 hours. The pilots had to show their skill by hovering over the gorge while the medics descended using winches. The condition of the woman they found was so unstable that she was given intravenous drugs on the spot to maintain her heart rate. She was wrapped in thermal blankets and brought on board. All this time, she did not make a sound, only stared at one point with dilated pupils. The helicopter took the victim to Flagstaff Medical Center at dusk. Doctors in the intensive care unit began to fight for her life, while trying to identify her. The woman did not have any documents with her. Her clothes had turned into rags that could not be identified. She did not answer questions, did not respond to requests to write her name. At about 21 o'clock, a detective from the county police arrived at the hospital. It was decided to take her fingerprints and run them through the missing persons database. The procedure took some time because the skin on the woman's fingers was damaged and dry. The result came to the computer on duty at 22 hours and 15 minutes. The system gave a 100% match. The name on the screen made the detective freeze. The fingerprints belonged to Karen Brown, a woman who had been buried in an empty coffin in memory of her family. A woman whose case had been gathering dust in the archives for 2 years. She had returned from the world of the dead, but what came back with her was something completely different from the cheerful tourist who parked her car outside the hotel 2 years ago. While the doctors were stabilizing her condition, one of the orderlies, while removing the remnants of her dirty clothes, noticed a strange detail on her forearm. It was not a fall injury or a scratch from a rock. The pale skin clearly showed a needle mark, and around it was a barely visible but unmistakable trace of a medical tourniquet. Dear friends, before we continue to unravel this tangle of gruesome events, I want to ask you a small favor. Right now, click the subscribe button, like this video, and write any comments below. It only takes a few seconds, but it's critical for YouTube's algorithms. Your activity will help push this video up in the recommendations so that as many people as possible can learn about this story. Thank you for your support. And now, back to the walls of the medical center, where doctors were trying to understand what really happened to Karen. Flagstaff Medical Center turned into a fortress that night. While journalists were on duty at the entrance, trying to find out the details of the miraculous rescue, a completely different, much darker drama was unfolding behind the closed doors of the intensive care unit. Doctors who were preparing to treat the patient for dehydration and exhaustion, typical of lost tourists, were confronted with a picture that shocked even experienced pathologists. What they saw completely contradicted the version of survival in the wild. The first alarming signal was the results of the X-ray examination. Images of her chest and limbs showed old but serious injuries. Karen had a broken tibia on her right leg and 3 ribs on her left side. But the most amazing thing was how these bones fused together. The trauma surgeon noted in his report that the fractures were fixed, but not surgically or with a professional cast. The bone callus had formed unevenly, which indicated that the limb had been immobilized using an artisanal method, probably with wooden splints and tight bandages. Someone provided her with medical care. It was done roughly, without anesthesia, but competently enough to ensure that the bones fused and the woman did not remain disabled for life. This fact immediately dismissed the possibility that she was alone. The next shock came when the results of the toxicology test came back 48 hours later. Karen's blood samples showed a high concentration of specific substances, ketamine and xylazine. These are powerful sedatives and muscle relaxants that are hardly ever used in humane medicine, but are widely used in veterinary medicine to anesthetize large animals, such as horses or cattle. This meant that the woman was not only held by force, but was kept in a state of constant chemical subjugation, turning her into an obedient doll, incapable of resistance or escape. She spent 2 years in a narcotic fog, where reality mixed with hallucinations. However, the condition of her skin raised the most questions. Dermatologists, having conducted a detailed examination under a microscope, confirmed the detective's worst fears. The complete absence of hair on the head and body was not the result of alopecia, hormonal disruption, or stress. Numerous microscopic cuts and traces of chemical burns were found on the scalp, armpits, and legs. This was evidence of methodical, regular intervention. Someone had shaved her with maniacal meticulousness and treated her skin with aggressive chemical mixtures for depilation. This happened regularly, at least once a week, throughout the entire time of her disappearance. Her body was turned into a blank canvas, stripped of any sign of individuality. Karen's psychological state was even more catastrophic. A psychiatrist diagnosed her with psychogenic mute. Physiologically, her vocal cords were intact, and the speech centers in her brain were functioning, as she responded to simple commands and understood the language addressed to her. But the psychological block was so powerful that she was physically unable to make a single sound. Her silence was a defense mechanism developed over years of fear. The hospital staff noticed specific triggers that caused the patient to have panic attacks. When a nurse accidentally dropped a metal tray of instruments on the tiled floor, the sharp sound of clanging metal made Karen curl up into a fetal position and cover her head with her hands, shaking with terror. She was expecting a blow. The second trigger was the smell. During the cleaning of the ward using a chlorine solution, the woman suffered a choking attack. She associated the smell of disinfection not with cleanliness, but with something unbearably terrible that was happening to her in captivity. Detective Michael Harris, who had been in charge of the case from day one, stood behind the glass of the ward and watched the doctors at work. He was putting together a puzzle in his head: fused bones, veterinary drugs, a shaved body, a fear of metal and chlorine. All these facts destroyed the convenient theory of miraculous survival. This was not a story of man's struggle against the elements. Nature does not put splints on fractures. Nature does not administer tranquilizers. Nature does not shave its victims. Harris realized that all this time they had been searching for a body that the desert had taken, while Karen was right there in someone's hands. She was not being rescued. She was being repaired and modified for some sick purpose. The detective moved away from the window and took out his radio. This was no longer an accident investigation, but a hunt for the kidnapper, who apparently had medical skills and access to specific drugs. When the nurse handed Harris the bag with the items cut from Karen, he noticed a strange dust clogging the seams of the rest of her clothes. It wasn't the red sand of the canyon or the dust from the cave. It was a white, fine, powder-like substance. Harris rubbed it between his fingers and brought it to his nose. A faint but recognizable smell of lime. On December 6, 2012, the Coconino County Sheriff's Office was tense, broken only by the hum of old fans and the rustle of huge topographic maps. Detective Michael Harris realized that time was running out. Karen Brown had been found alive, but her condition indicated that her place of confinement was somewhere very close by. A woman in this physical condition, with fused fractures and atrophied muscles, could not have walked a long distance on her own. The cave where she was found was only a temporary hiding place, the end point of her escape, not a place of long-term detention. The investigative team mapped out a 5-mile radius circle around the victim's location. It was a wild, rugged area dominated by cliffs, pine forests, and deep ravines. Most of this area belonged to the national park, but there was one blind spot at the northern border, where the protected area turned into private property. It was a patch of forest isolated from the main tourist routes by an old dirt road. It was there, just 2 miles from the national park boundary, that the only residential property in the quadrant was located, a private ranch called Willow Creek Homestead. According to cadastral records, the property was owned by a 58-year-old man named Silas Graves. His record was surprisingly clean, even too sterile for a man of his age. No police records, no speeding tickets in the last 10 years, no debts or lawsuits. Graves led a secluded life, rarely appeared in the city, and did not officially work anywhere, living on the income from investments made in the 90s. However, when detectives gained access to his bank statements, the perfect facade of a good citizen cracked. An analysis of transactions over the past 24 months revealed a strange pattern. Silas Graves, a single man with no children and no elderly dependents, regularly visited a pharmacy in the town of Williams, 60 miles from his ranch. The reports from the pharmacy gave Detective Harris a chill. The purchases were specific and large-scale. Once every 2 weeks, Graves bought large quantities of high-calorie enteral formula, a liquid food usually prescribed for bedridden patients or people who cannot chew their own food. The volume of purchases far exceeded the needs of one person. But an even more disturbing item on the receipts was a chemical waxing cream. Graves bought it in industrial quantities, 10 to 15 tubes at a time. The dates of the purchases correlated perfectly with the period of Karen Brown's disappearance. It was the same chemical trace that dermatologists saw on the victim's skin. On December 7, 2012, at 10 o'clock in the morning, a black police SUV turned off the highway onto a broken gravel road leading to Willow Creek. The woods stood as a wall, blocking out the sun, and the silence was so deep that the sound of the engine seemed like thunder. When the detectives drove up to the gate, they were struck by the contrast between the wilderness around them and the perfect order on the ranch. The grass was trimmed, the tools were folded to size, and the house itself looked like it had just been painted. Silas Graves stepped out onto the porch before the police could even knock. He looked like an intelligent retired professor, an ironed plaid shirt, clean pants, and a neatly trimmed gray beard. His gaze was calm, direct, and absolutely cold. There was no fear, no surprise, no curiosity. The emotions that people usually experience when detectives from the Major Crimes Department show up at their doorstep. "What can I do for the officers?" he asked in a flat voice, not inviting the guests in. Detective Harris began a standardized interview, watching the owner's reaction. Graves answered clearly, concisely, and without avoiding eye contact. He confirmed that he lived alone and stated that he had not seen any tourists in the area. When it came to shopping at the pharmacy, he didn't even bat an eye. "I have a weak stomach, officer. And the cream? I don't like to shave with a razor. I have sensitive skin. That's not a crime, is it?" he replied with a subtle, condescending smile. But it wasn't the house that caught Harris's attention. It was another structure on the property. About 50 yards from the residential cottage stood a massive, windowless metal shed. It was painted gray and looked too new and fortified for an ordinary shed. A separate concrete walkway led to it, and a heavy electronic lock hung on the massive steel door. "We'd like to take a look around your property, Mr. Graves, including that building," Harris said, pointing to the hangar. For the first time in the entire conversation, Graves' mask of calmness flinched for a moment. His shoulders tensed, and his polite smile disappeared, giving way to cold categoricalness. "That's impossible," he said. "They store highly toxic fertilizers and pesticides for my garden. Entering without protective suits is life-threatening. I don't have the keys with me. They are in a safe deposit box in town. Without a warrant, I will not allow you to risk your health on my private property." He was lying. Harris could feel it in his bones. Graves's calmness was unnatural, the behavior of a predator confident in his invulnerability. Returning to the car, the detective noticed a detail that finally convinced him that they had found the hijacker. On the roof of the toxic hangar, which was supposedly used only for storing fertilizers, there was a modern, powerful ventilation and air conditioning system that was running at full capacity despite the cool weather. The fertilizer bags do not breathe and do not require climate control. There was something alive behind the steel walls. On December 12, 2012, at exactly 6 o'clock in the morning, a convoy of 3 armored police SWAT vehicles and 2 patrol cars without sirens turned onto the gravel road leading to the Willow Creek estate. The district judge, after reviewing evidence of financial transactions and surveillance reports, signed the search warrant in less than an hour. The operation was classified as high risk. The suspect's psychological profile indicated that he might offer armed resistance or have traps on the property. The fog that morning was thick and cold, spreading downhill, hiding the movement of the seizure team. Operatives in full tactical gear silently surrounded the perimeter. A sniper took up position on the roof of a neighboring building. The silence on the ranch was absolute, broken only by the distant barking of dogs on neighboring farms. At 6 hours and 15 minutes, the group commander gave the signal for the assault. The front door of the main house was smashed in with a battering ram. The group burst inside shouting, "Police! On the floor!" But only silence met them in response. The rooms were empty. The bed in the bedroom was made with army neatness, and there were no dirty dishes or leftovers in the kitchen. Only a barely warm kettle on the stove indicated that the owner had been here recently. Silas Graves was gone. Tire tracks in the backyard indicated that a heavy pickup truck had left the property just 10 to 15 minutes before the police arrived, using an old logging road that was not on the patrol officer's maps. Realizing that the suspect had fled, Detective Harris ordered the officers to focus on the main object, a metal shed. The massive steel door was locked with an electronic padlock, which had to be cut with hydraulic shears. When the metal gave way and the door creaked open, a wave of stolen chemical air hit the operatives in the face. What they saw inside made even experienced Special Forces veterans stop at the threshold. It was not a fertilizer warehouse or a utility room. It was an operating room. The walls of the huge room were covered from floor to ceiling with a white noise-absorbing material similar to that used in recording studios or psychiatric hospitals for violent patients. This material absorbed any sound: screaming, moaning, crying. Nothing could escape. In the middle of the room, under bright surgical lights, there was a medical bed. It was not new, but it was kept perfectly clean. Thick leather straps with buckles worn from frequent use were attached to the bed rails. The straps were positioned to fix not only the arms and legs, but also the head and torso, completely immobilizing the person. Next to the bed was a drip rack with empty intravenous feeding bags. In the corner of the room was a tall metal shelf. On its shelves, lined up in perfectly straight rows, were dozens of cans. It was the same chemical hair removal product that Graves bought by the box. Nearby were stacks of sterile towels, surgical razors, tweezers, and cotton swabs. The smell in the room was a mixture of chlorine, ozone, and a specific aroma of burnt hair that had been ingrained in the walls. On a small metal table near the entrance was a thick, black-bound notebook. It wasn't just a diary, it was a laboratory journal. Detective Harris, wearing new latex gloves, carefully opened it. Graves' handwriting was small, sharp, and frighteningly legible. The notes were written with the meticulousness of a scientist, observing an experiment on a rat. No emotions, just facts, dates, and dosages of drugs. On a page dated August 2010, there was an entry. Day 14. Subject refuses to eat. Attempts at resistance are suppressed. A tranquilizer has been administered. The dosage has been increased to 5 milligrams. Pulse is stabilizing. Harris turned the pages, and a 2-year-long chronicle of hell unfolded before his eyes. Graves recorded every step of Karen's dehumanization. He described how he shaved her, how he treated her skin with acid peels to destroy the follicles, how he weaned her from speaking, punishing every sound with water deprivation. An inscription near the end of the notebook made the detective shudder. Day 400. Purification is successful. Hair has stopped growing so fast. She no longer screams. She is becoming quiet. She is becoming clean. The perfect shape is almost achieved. It became finally clear. This was not a kidnapping for ransom or sexual violence in the usual sense. Silas Graves was trying to create an ideal creature from a living woman according to his sick standards. No hair, no voice, no will of his own. A doll that would breathe but not live. While inspecting the room, one of the forensic scientists noticed a strange device near the ventilation shaft. It was a timer connected to an aerosol spray system. Graves hadn't just disappeared. He had prepared the place for the arrival of guests. There were less than 2 minutes left on the timer, and wires were running from the device to canisters labeled chlorine. Harris instantly realized Graves' plan to destroy traces of the biological material and possibly the police officers themselves in a cloud of poisonous gas. "Everybody out, now! It's a trap!" the detective shouted, pushing his men toward the door as the numbers on the small screen inexorably counted down the seconds until the decontamination system was activated. While the SWAT team was eliminating the threat of chemical contamination in the hangar, Detective Michael Harris sat in his office, surrounded by stacks of archival documents that smelled of dust and old toner. To understand the motives of the beast who created this sterile torture chamber, it was necessary to look into his past. And this past, as it turned out, was as dark and pathological as his present. The query of the federal database yielded results almost instantly, as investigators began to dig deeper than the standard criminal record check. In the 90s, Silas Graves lived in Phoenix and worked as an intensive care unit nurse at one of the city's major hospitals. His personnel file was filled with reprimands that became increasingly disturbing over time. His colleagues described him as a reclusive, meticulous worker who was obsessed with cleanliness. He could spend hours polishing instruments or changing bedding for patients who didn't need it. But the real reason for his dismissal in 1998 made the detectives' blood run cold. Graves was dismissed in a scandal after a series of complaints from relatives of patients who were in a coma or in serious condition after a stroke. The relatives noticed that their loved ones' heads were shaved bald, although there were no medical indications for this. When the hospital administration pushed Graves against the wall, he did not object. In an explanatory note, a copy of which Harris held in his hands, Silas wrote in a smooth, calm handwriting, "Hair is an antenna for dirt. They absorb bad thoughts and sickness. I just cleaned them. I was making them free of memories." Then the case was hushed up to avoid lawsuits, and Graves simply disappeared from the medical system, moving closer to the wilderness where no one would interfere with his philosophy. But the most frightening answers were not hidden in the hospital's archives, but in the very laboratory journal found in the hangar. This notebook became the key to the events of August 14, 2010. What the police thought was an accident and later a planned kidnapping was in fact a fatal coincidence. Graves described that day in frightening detail. He did not track Karen on purpose. That morning, he was in the national park illegally, poaching small game off the tourist trails. In his diary, he called it resource gathering. Around noon, while hiding in a juniper bush, he spotted a lone figure in a blue t-shirt. Karen Brown had wandered off the Bright Angel Trail, presumably in search of a better angle for a photo or shade. The recording from August 14 read, "Subject was moving unsteadily. She stumbled on a scree. I heard a crunch. She fell and could not get up. She was calling for help. I approached her. She saw me and stretched out her hand. She thought I was a ranger or a rescuer. She was dirty. Her hair was tangled with sweat and dust. I realized it was a sign. She needed to be cleansed." Instead of helping the woman, who had twisted her ankle and was in pain, Graves pulled out a syringe of veterinary tranquilizer from his camping kit, which he always carried to put captured animals to sleep. The injection was instantaneous. Before Karen could even realize what had happened, the world around her went black. Graves, with his remarkable physical strength, carried her unconscious body through the bushes to the old logging road where his pickup truck was parked. It was there, in the juniper bushes, that he probably accidentally dropped her trekking pole as he was carrying her body more comfortably. For 3 days, while Karen's parents were going crazy with suspense and the police were delaying the search, Graves was already setting up a personal hell for her in his soundproof hangar. But the most horrifying discovery was the truth about her injuries. X-rays taken after the rescue showed fractures in her ribs and tibia. Investigators assumed that she had sustained them during a fall on the trail, but Graves' diary refuted this theory, revealing even greater cruelty. An entry dated October 15, 2010, 2 months after the abduction, described an escape attempt incident. In the first months of her captivity, when the effects of the drugs were not yet so intense, Karen tried to fight. One day, when Graves brought food and was momentarily distracted, she hit him with a metal tray and rushed to the door. She managed to run out of the hangar and into the night forest. "The subject was ungrateful and aggressive," Graves wrote. "I had to use force to stop him. The fall into the ravine was hard. I heard a bone crack. Now she won't be able to escape. It's for the best. Movement interferes with healing." He did not take her to the hospital. He dragged her back to the hangar, broken and screaming in pain. He set the bones himself, applied homemade splints and tight bandages, enjoying the complete power he had over her body. He was playing the doctor he had always dreamed of being, but in his version of medicine, the patient had no say. He fused her bones together so that she could live, but broke her will so that she belonged only to him. It was during that period that he began shaving her head, punishing her for her escape attempt, and convincing her that it was her hair that pushed her to do this dirty deed. Detective Harris closed his notebook, feeling nauseous. Before him was a portrait not just of a maniac, but of a man with a distorted value system who sincerely believed he was doing good. Graves did not consider himself a jailer. He considered himself a healer. And now this healer was out there, somewhere in the vast world, with his tools, his beliefs, and, most frightening of all, a sense of unfinished mission. Suddenly, the phone on the detective's desk rang sharply, breaking the silence of the office. The call was from a patrol crew on duty on Highway 40. The officer's voice on the phone was trembling with adrenaline. They had found a vehicle matching the description of Graves' pickup truck, but what was inside the cab made them call for backup and stay away. On December 15, 2012, 72 hours after the storming of the Willow Creek Ranch, the hunt for Silas Graves reached its climax. All this time, the Arizona State Police, the FBI, and the Ranger Service had been on high alert. An APB with Graves' photo was broadcast on every TV channel, and his description was posted at every gas station within a 500-mile radius. But the fugitive made a mistake typical of criminals who think they are smarter than the system. He returned to a place he thought was safe. Around 11 o'clock in the morning, a highway patrol crew driving around the area near the abandoned Black Mesa quarry noticed suspicious activity. The site, located 40 miles from the Grand Canyon, had long been an industrial dumping ground where old machinery rusted and was rarely visited by casual travelers. Among the piles of rocks and old excavators, the officers saw a dusty pickup truck half hidden behind a pile of rubble. A man was standing near the rear bumper of the vehicle. He was methodically, slowly unscrewing the license plate. The patrol policeman, acting in accordance with the instructions for detaining particularly dangerous criminals, called for reinforcements and, without turning on their sirens, approached the object with bare weapons. When the officer ordered the man to raise his hands and lie down on the ground over the loudspeaker, he did not even flinch. Silas Graves slowly put the screwdriver on the trunk, wiped his hands on a rag, and calmly turned to the police. His face showed neither fear nor anger. He looked like a man who was just tired of playing a long game. "I was waiting for you to find me," were the only words he said during the arrest. He did not resist when the handcuffs were fastened around his wrists. Inside his car, they found a supply of food, a map of Mexico, and another box with the same medical records he had been keeping for 2 years. The interrogation of Silas Graves began that evening in an interrogation room in Flagstaff. Detective Michael Harris, who was sitting across from the kidnapper, expected to see a crazed fanatic or a silent sociopath. Instead, he was looking at a rational, cold storyteller. Graves spoke about his crimes as if he were describing a complex surgical operation. But the main question that plagued the investigation remained open. How exactly did a woman who was under the influence of tranquilizers and physically exhausted manage to escape from a perfectly secure prison? The story Graves told turned out to be banal, and at the same time, horrifying in its simplicity. The system failed not because of the victim's actions, but because of the executioner's weakness. A week before the tourists found Karen in the cave, at the end of November 2012, Silas Graves had a severe hypertensive crisis. It happened right in the hangar, during the evening feeding procedure. In his testimony, Graves described in detail how he felt a sharp pain in the back of his head and lost his orientation. He fell to the floor next to Karen's bed, losing consciousness. At that moment, he had just loosened the straps on her arms to give her water. The keys to the electronic lock of the front door fell out of his pocket and rolled across the sterile white floor. Karen, who was half asleep at the time, did not realize what was happening at first. She lay still, listening to the heavy, raspy breathing of her tormentor. But her instinct for self-preservation, suppressed by years of chemical exposure, suddenly awoke. She realized that God, as Graves sometimes called himself, had fallen. Gathering the remnants of her strength, she freed her arms. Her legs could barely support her body weight. Her muscles were atrophied. She grabbed the keys with trembling fingers. Graves lay motionless. She could have killed him with the scalpel on the table, but her fear of him was stronger than her hatred. Her only wish was to disappear. She pushed open the heavy door and stepped out into the cold night. She was wearing only a thin hospital gown. The temperature outside was approaching 0. She had a choice: run into the woods surrounding the ranch, or head toward the rocky desert of the canyon. For her, the forest was the personification of horror. It was from the forest that Graves had come. In the forest, he hunted. The trees seemed to her like living traps, so she chose an open space, guided by animal fear. She ran towards the canyon, hoping that they would not find her there, among the stones. She walked, crawled, and fell for 2 days. The cold was chilling her to the bone, but her adrenaline was driving her forward. She found the same karst cave near Horseshoe Mesa by accident, trying to hide from the wind. She crawled into the darkest corner, covered with old blankets left there by other hikers years ago, and froze, waiting for Graves to follow. But Graves did not come. When he woke up in the hangar a few hours after his escape, he saw an empty bed and an open door. Instead of giving chase, he felt disgusted. When questioned, he told Detective Harris the phrase that best characterized his madness. "I gave her a chance to be perfect. I cleansed her of the dirt of this world, but she chose to run away. She chose to return to the dirt. When I realized that she had left, I decided that she was not worthy of my efforts. She rejected the gift of purification. I didn't look for her, because for me she died the second she crossed the threshold of the hangar." This arrogance saved Karen's life. If Graves had started a pursuit, he would have easily caught up with her in a few hours, knowing the area. But his ego was so big that he let her go, believing that the desert would punish the ungrateful one. He was wrong. The canyon didn't kill her, but kept her alive until rescuers arrived. As Detective Harris was turning off the recorder, Graves asked for a glass of water. His hands were not shaking. He was ready for trial, absolutely sure of his innocence, not even realizing that investigators had found another detail in his diary, a diagram of another building he planned to build, and a list of 3 new female names he had chosen as candidates to replace Karen. The trial in the case of State of Arizona versus Silas Graves began on March 4, 2013, in the Coconino County Superior Court. It was an event that captured the attention of the entire country, but the courtroom was not dominated by media hysteria, but by a heavy, oppressive silence. The prosecutor, an experienced lawyer named David Ross, built the case not on emotions, but on cold facts that were documented by the defendant himself. The evidence base was absolute. The key witness for the prosecution was the same black-bound laboratory notebook found in the hangar. Every page of this notebook was read aloud to the jury. The entries on the dosage of tranquilizers, detailed descriptions of the procedures of forced depilation, and psychological breakdown of the personality caused shock among the audience. When the prosecutor showed photos of the hangar, from the inside white walls, leather belts, shelves of chemicals, several jurors looked away. It was a chronicle of the transformation of a man into a thing. Silas Graves, sitting in the dock in an orange prison robe, looked completely detached. He refused to have the last word, but his lawyer later told the press that his client would not plead guilty to torture. Graves sincerely believed that he was an unrecognized visionary, a researcher of human nature whose great work was interrupted by ignorant people with police badges. There was not a shadow of remorse on his face, only a slight grimace of contempt when witnesses described Karen's suffering. For him, she was an unfinished project that had gone bad, not a living woman. The verdict was announced on May 28, 2013. The judge, reading out the decision, called Graves' actions an act of absolute, refined cruelty that goes beyond human understanding. Silas Graves was sentenced to 3 consecutive life sentences without parole, plus an additional 150 years for kidnapping and illegal medical practice. When the judge's gavel was dropped, Graves did not even blink. He was escorted out of the courtroom, and the door closed behind him forever. The ending of this story takes us exactly 1 year ahead. May 2014, Scottsdale, Arizona. A quiet, green neighborhood where houses are hidden in the shade of sprawling palm trees and oleanders. Here, in her parents' house, Karen Brown walked a long and painful path of returning to reality. The physical wounds healed faster than the mental ones. The scars from the fractures on her leg and ribs turned white and became almost invisible. The body, cleansed of the remnants of veterinary drugs, regained its strength. But the most noticeable change was her appearance. Karen was no longer the bald, alien-like creature found in the cave. Her hair had begun to grow back. She now wore a neat, thick, dark-colored bob that gently framed her face. For her, it was not just a matter of aesthetics. Every millimeter of her hair was a symbol of her victory over Graves, proof that his purification had failed. She could comb her hair, feel the wind in it, simple things that had been forbidden during 2 years of hell. But one problem remained unresolved. Karen was silent. Her psychogenic mute was persistent. She visited a speech therapist and a psychotherapist 3 times a week, wrote her thoughts in a notebook, communicated with gestures, but her voice was blocked somewhere deep inside, behind a wall of fear. The doctor said it was a block at the subconscious level. In captivity, sound meant punishment, and her brain refused to break this rule. The last evening of our story. The sun is slowly sinking below the horizon, painting the Arizona sky in fiery reds and purples. Karen is sitting in a wicker chair on the open veranda of her parents' house. The air is filled with the scent of orange blossom trees and stone heated during the day. She looks calm. She is wearing a simple white shirt and jeans. Through the open glass door from the kitchen, the sounds of the normal life she has been deprived of for so long come through. Her parents, elderly people who have aged 10 years during the search, are arguing. It's a good, everyday argument. "I told you to add more basil to the sauce, Marta," her father grumbles. "And I'm saying you always oversalt the meat, Henry," the mother replies, clanging pots and pans. These sounds, the clanging of dishes, the voices of her family, the noise of the TV in the living room, no longer scare Karen. She listens to them like music. She turns her gaze to the table next to the chair. There is a thick manuscript bound with a rubber band. On the first page is a title in large letters, Grand Canyon Flora, Life on the Rock. The author is Karen Brown. She did not hate the canyon. She decided to explore it. She turned her trauma into a scientific endeavor, describing plants that survive in the harshest conditions, just as she did. Karen looks up at the sunset. The last rays touch her face. She takes a deep breath, filling her lungs with the air of freedom. Her lips, which have been silent for 3 years, slowly part. The muscles in her throat tense, overcoming an invisible barrier. It's hard, like pushing a huge stone, but she makes the effort. Quietly, hoarsely, but clearly, she utters a single word, addressing not her parents, not the doctors, but herself and the world that tried to break her. Alive. She smiles at the corners of her lips and places her palm on the manuscript of her book. Darkness slowly covers Scottsdale, but it is no longer the darkness of a cave or a hangar. It's just a night that is sure to be followed by a new dawn.